When I was 8 years old, the most scary thing that could ever happen to an 8-year-old happened to me. I went to a place that was so far away from home. This place was so scary. It was windy, it was cold, there were so many people there. I was really, really scared. I thought, how am I going to survive in this place? This was my first day in boarding school. The most scary thing about being in boarding school was I was the shortest person there. There was 500 kids, and out of these 500 kids, I was the shortest one. Now, if you imagine that, every time I looked up, I saw elbows. This was my view for a very long time. Now, everything you've seen in the movies about boarding school is accurate. The schedule runs like clockwork. Every day, we woke up at 5 a.m., we had breakfast at 6, we had assembly at 7, we went to class at 8, we had tea at 10, we had lunch at 12, we had tea again at 4, we had dinner at 6, we went to class at 7, we went to bed at 9, lights were out at 10. For 9 years. The other thing that is pretty accurate about boarding schools is that there's a very strict reporting structure. The students reported to the student leaders, who reported to the teachers, who reported to the principal, who reported to our parents. Everybody was being watched. Now, I was really looking forward to my first break after my first semester. And when I got home, I realized it wasn't very much different for boarding school, actually, because my aunt Juliet watched us, and Mom watched her. Now, it wasn't until many years later that I got over that first experience of boarding school. It wasn't until many years later that I was able to truly appreciate going to boarding school. When I graduated college and I entered into the workplace, I realized that life in the workplace wasn't very much different from boarding school. We had to be in the same building, we had to arrive at 6, we had to arrive at 9, we had to leave at 6. Actually, the only difference was that instead of reporting to a short, scary principal, I was now reporting to a businessman. Other than that, I had to report to a manager, who reported to a senior manager, who reported to a director, who reported to the company owners. Now, several years later, I decided to start my own business. And I had a dream job, and this job was to work in an agency that I had seen my friends work in. It had 9,000 employees in 70 countries. And I thought, well, I could build an agency like that. This was my goal. The only problem was that that agency was 80 years old. So I thought, I don't have 80 years. How will I ever build an agency to that size and still enjoy it in my lifetime? It felt impossible. So naturally, I talked to my friends about it. I told them, I have this goal to start my own agency. And the response from my friends, as you can expect, was far from encouraging. I had responses like, you're crazy. Good luck to not having a salary ever again. You can call me when you're bankrupt, I'll buy you a meal. My personal favorite, why don't you get a husband first? And adding that to the fact that every piece of research I was doing was telling me that 7 out of 10 businesses fail within the first 5 years, I thought, how could I do this? That's a really mind-boggling statistic. That means that if the people in the front row start a business after this talk, in 5 years, 7 out of you will most likely have failed. I didn't want to be one of the 7. I wanted to be the 30% that succeeds. And at some point, I thought maybe I should just build an agency like everybody else. Have a regular office. Build it one employee at a time. Work in the agency until I'm 50, and then maybe pass it on to my kids if they want it. And maybe 100 years from now, we might have 80 offices. But that didn't include me enjoying that within my lifetime. I didn't like this plan at all. Now, let's put that aside for a minute. Aside from being interested in business, I'm a pretty responsible person. I was watching the news about what is happening to a forest cover in Africa, and there's increased deforestation. So I decided to do something about it. I bought a small piece of land. I decided to plant some trees. And I wanted to have my own forest. I thought, this is going to be my own little forest. Don't worry about it. Land in Africa is super cheap. Anyone can have their own forest. Everyone here, you can all have your own forest. It's actually like buying a car or paying your rent, if you look at it by the kind of rents we pay. So I was doing research about trees and how to plant my own forest. And one of the things I learned is that when trees grow in the forest, they naturally grow 50 to 60 feet apart. Now, obviously, when I went into Google, my first question was, what is the closest I can plant trees to have as many trees as possible without killing them? And the answer was 5 to 6 feet. This was my plan. I was going to plant trees at 5 to 6 feet apart. But then I realized I need to change my plan. If I want the trees to survive, I must include some distance between them. The other thing I learned while I was researching trees, while I was planting the trees, in the actual process of it, I realized that I wasn't planting one tree. I was planting hundreds of seeds. And these trees would one day grow to form a forest. Because it would be crazy to just plant one tree. I was planting several trees. So I thought, why don't I think about my business in that way? Instead of planting just one office, why don't I plant several seeds in different parts of the world and treat the world as if it was my farm? And those seeds would grow, and 10 years from now, we might have a forest. Now, the reason I wasn't thinking about business this way in the beginning is because I was already structured in this boarding school way of thinking. Every single boarding school I had been to, from the very first one when I was 8 to where I was working, had taught me about keeping things together, keeping everyone together, having very strict structures, having very old rules that never changed. And that has worked for some businesses. It wasn't working for my business. What was happening actually is what it was resulting into micromanagement. It was resulting in joyriders and observers who show up to work and wait for 6 o'clock. It was also resulting in people trying to cheat the rules. So I decided to look at it different and approach my business in a different way. Now, this change happened at some point while I was running my business, but for the first year, I did try to run the business in this way. And I realized that having everyone together was expensive. It means bigger teams, it means bigger offices, it means higher bills, and it was only going to work if I could afford it. It wasn't easy. Now, I realized that this way of thinking and spreading out was actually what life had become. Families have gotten smaller. Families don't live together as much as we used to before, because living together means higher daily bills. It means intellectually you maintain the same school of thought. It means emotionally you fight all the time. Even in companies that have already been established, American corporations have moved to China. Chinese corporations have moved to Africa. African corporations are spreading into the rest of Africa. Now, in some cases, it makes sense to keep everything together. For example, when you're raising young children, you want to keep them as close as possible. You want to teach them values. You want to prepare them for the challenging world. But then, at some point, you have to let them go. You have to send them into the rest of the world and allow them to experience and take these values that you've put in them to the rest of the world. Now, with this way of looking at business, 2 years from the day I set up the company, we have planted seeds in 5 countries. What that means is, instead of having one big office where we could have 100 people, we now have 5 offices with between 5 to 10 people. That instantly gives us an international presence. That puts us closer to our clients, because if a client wants to have a meeting with us, they're based in Nigeria, they can walk into our office in Nigeria. If they want us to meet their sales team, and their team is based in Kenya, they can meet our team in Kenya. If they're flying from Nigeria and they have a layover in Dubai, they can meet our team in Dubai. Instantly, that has helped our team as well be forced to work together, because this is not a structure where every company or every country is independent. Remember, these are not independent offices. This is a company where the departments were split and every department was sent to a different country. So every single day, a designer in India has to work with a content writer in Dubai, who has to work with a researcher in Nigeria, who has to work with a copy editor in the United States. That forces people to work together. It has integrated us culturally, and it has made us more culturally sensitive to each other. Now, financially, it has instantly doubled and increased the amount of clients that we have access to, because we can walk into a sales meeting in any of these countries. Something else that has happened is that by us not being able to see every single person, because naturally they're in a different country, there's less micromanagement. Now, politics in the company and rumors have dropped instantly, because it's much easier to gossip around the coffee machine or the water dispenser than it is to gossip over the internet. Now, remember the analogy of the trees and the seeds that we started with. What this has done is that those seeds that we've planted will one day, at the same time, and naturally grow together to form our forest. Thank you.